Let's take a look at how to get the most out of that new tattooing machine from Weaver. That's coming up. Hello everyone, my name's Daniel Reitz. This is Weaver Leather Supply. Today, we're gonna take another look at the tattooing machine from Weaver. We're gonna be taking a look at it to see how to get the most out of it, some tips and tricks that will allow you to get more out of it and get it to do what you want it to do. But before we jump into it, we've already done one video, and that video goes through, we take on a project with it, we take a look at how it works, we did an unboxing, and I give you my thoughts on who I think should buy this and maybe who shouldn't. So if you haven't seen that yet, definitely take a look at it. You can look at it before or after this video, but it's definitely worth a watch. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at how this thing works and some of the things you can do with it to get different effects. The first thing that you need to be aware of is that this little plus minus right here, let me turn it on, that way you can see it. Yep. So this little plus minus, this right here, that turns the voltage up and down, and essentially it's like a volume knob. The higher the voltage, the faster it goes. So if we've got a really high speed, let's say the voltage is up around 9, well, at that point, you're getting a really smooth, consistent line. If we run it down, like you can run it all the way down to around 5, if we run it down there, you're going to get more of a staccato kind of a stippling effect with it. So that voltage not only affects how fast it goes, but it affects the results and the consistency and smoothness that you get with it. So as I was playing with it during that first video that we mentioned, one of the things that really impressed me is how tight of a space you can work in. If you put the small needle in there and we turn the speed up on it so we're getting a really consistent line, you can work in some really tight spaces that are really hard to get into with traditional tools. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm just going to turn the speed up on the machine and put that small tip in there. Then we're going to go through and just do like a real tight squiggly line just so you can get an idea how tight you can work and how consistent and smooth those lines can be. So as you're running lines, I guess would be a good way to put it, whether it's a straight line or we're following, the curved lines like you would in a floral arrangement or something like that, you're going to get different effects depending on the orientation of the machine. If we're straight up and down, you're essentially getting a pencil line, just like if you were using a pencil. If you were to angle it over on its side a little bit, you get a different effect. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. So one of the other things I want to talk about while we're going over how to pull lines with the tattooing machine is that I got the best results, the cleanest results, when I would pull a line, lift it, and then do it again if it needed a second pass. What I don't want to do is put it down and then run it back and forth like this. I got really jagged lines when I did the back and forth motion versus pulling a line, lifting it, and then doing it again. You can run it as many times as you need to. Just try not to do the back and forth thing with it. So I said you get a little bit of a different effect if you lean it over on its side. And what I found, instead of holding it like a pencil right on the end of the machine, if I hold it a little further back and I tip it over close to a 45, something like that, and then I pull the line, I end up, not only do I get the line, but I also get a bevel, just like if I were to cut the line in with a swivel knife and then go over it with a traditional bevel. And that's one of the things that I really liked about the machine. I can do a swivel knife cut and a bevel at the same time. Now they look a little bit different than if you were to do it with the traditional tools. It's not exactly the same. But let's say I'm in a super tight area and I really don't want to chew up this area. Well, I can lean it over on its side, run that line, and pick up a bevel at the same time. That can be a huge advantage. So one thing I want to mention is that occasionally you'll hear me say needle. I've also started saying stylus tip. The needles in this are not sharp. They're even more blunt than what you would find with a leather sewing needle, which is really nice because obviously we don't want to, stab ourselves with it. But you'll hear me say needle or you'll hear me say stylus tip or just tip. So ordinarily we would use the thick or the thin single needle tip to create those lines. Essentially, it's just a single piece of metal in there that would create the line for us. But what I found is that we can also use it to create texture. And in this example, I'm going to show you a little bit of an area where we can actually create a scaled or a cobblestone effect. Now, Mr. Editor, if you will zoom in a little bit so they can get a good look at it, it might go a little bit fuzzy, so forgive me for that, but at least you'll get a good look at it. Let's say that you're working on a scene that's got a cobblestone effect to it, or you're wanting to do a snake or a dragon or something like that. This little effect where you take this fine tip and just work in very controlled circles would give you an amazing effect. That would be really cool to be able to use that on a project like what we just talked about. So what about writing? That's a natural question because this is kind of shaped like a super fat pencil or marker. So naturally, you wonder whether or not this can actually write. Well, I wondered the same thing. So what I did is I just took a pencil and I wrote the word weaver. Just nothing fancy, just kind of wrote it out. You're always going to want to write it out, in my opinion. That way you have something to follow. You've predetermined where the letters are going to go and the spacing. So I wrote out the word weaver and then I went back over it with the fine tip needle just to see how it worked. So as you can see, the writing came out pretty good. Is it as good as if you went in, laid it out, and then spent hours tooling it? No, nowhere close to that. But at the same time, I didn't use a pattern. I just wrote it in and then I quickly traced over the top of those letters. So for doing that, it turned out pretty good. So what about shading and backgrounding? Well, the kit comes with a tip that has 3 needles and they're kind of shaped like that. They're clustered together like that. And the higher speed or the lower speed you use, you get different effects. Also, how heavy of a touch you use on the leather will really create a different effect. So I'm going to start out with a higher speed and kind of a medium to light touch just to show you what kind of effect we get. And I think what you're going to see is that it's a little bit smoother texture than when we go with the slower speed. One of the other textures that we can create with the tattooling machine, that's hard to switch over, but one of the other textures you can get with it is stippling. Now, stippling is just a fancy word for dots. But remember, the shader that we're working with has 3 needles on it. So if we take it and we turn the speed way down on it, I mean like 5, 5.5, somewhere around in there, and then we very lightly let those needles bounce, and I'm taking the pen and I'm bouncing it like this on the leather, then that's going to create that stippling effect that we're looking for. In the previous video that we did, we used that technique to create the leaves on the branches. You can use stippling for all kinds of different effects. It's really simple to do, and this makes it even easier. So with the next one, I wanted to play around a little bit and just see what kind of effects you could get. So I got my little rectangle there where we're putting the texture in. I went over the top of it and did the same exact thing from the previous step. I stippled over the top of it with that 3-pronged, that 3-needle tip. After that, I switched it out for one of the other tips. I believe this was the wider tip, but it's a single needle. And then I went through and I did that same stippling technique with that single tip instead of the 3, and it gave us a lot more dimension. The one with the 3 is a lot more subtle, and then you go back over it with the single and you get the depth and dimension because the single tipped dots are a lot more pronounced than the shader stippling dots are. So that kind of brought up the question, well, if I can create texture with a single tip, meaning the single needle, can I shade with it? So I thought, well, why not? Let's give it a shot. So I went back to one of the other little rectangles that we had worked in, made sure it was cased properly. And then I just went over and I went in small little controlled circles and just covered the area within that little rectangle. And I was really happy with the texture it gave me. It's a lot smoother and a lot more consistent than if I'm using the three needle tip. Now, that doesn't mean it's better. It just means it's different. It depends on the effect and the look that you're looking for. And also, I mentioned casing. We want to case the leather about the same way we would if we were going to tool it, or maybe just a little bit more damp, but you want it about in the same range. So one of the techniques that you can do with this that I'm a little undecided about is called whip shading or whip strokes. And that's where you're going to just drag it quickly across the top of the leather. Usually you're going to use a little bit lower speed and you're just going to pull it quickly across the leather. And this is going to give you kind of a staccato effect with the marks that it leaves on there. Now, the reason I'm a little hesitant about it is because I want to always be in control of where things start, where they stop, and how deep and intense the marks are that I'm leaving on the leather, whether it's with a tattooling machine or it's with a stamp or maybe it's with a lifter. I want to be in control of that. And with those whip strokes, that can be really difficult to control where that stroke stops. Now, if we're talking about something like hair, maybe you're doing a portrait or a horse or something like that, it's got long hair. I could see it maybe working for that, but I'm still a little undecided. And truthfully, I might be doing that wrong as far as the motion and the technique with it. So I'm going to reserve the right to change my mind on this. But for right now, I'm a little hesitant to suggest using those whip strokes, that whip shading with it. But, you know, I might change my mind about that later. So that's going to do it for this video. I will see you in the next one. In the meantime, go make something amazing.